The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. Jeff, I have to start you with asking you to tell the listeners the story of Pablo Escobar's nephew, Nicholas, and what happened in that house, which is the opening of your book. And I mean, it couldn't be more of a draw for the rest of it.
I was looking for a place to start a book about money laundering. And look, as well, you know, Nicola, the money laundering is not an easy subject. Can be quite dry, can be quite technical, a lot like the cybercrime stuff that I've covered. So I was looking for like an easy in. How do you get, people interested and get the message over to them fairly quickly at the first off? And I heard about this story where Pablo Escobar, as people well know, Pablo Escobar smuggled heaps of cocaine and had a problem with the money that he was then making because he had to launder the money, had to get the money back to Colombia. And there was a point where he was smuggling so much money, so much cocaine into the US that for every plane of cocaine he smuggled in, he was smuggling 2 planes of cash back to Colombia, which just became a logistical problem. What do you do with all that cash? So he started stashing it in the walls of the houses, the safe houses that he was using it to hide it. Years later, his nephew, Nicholas Escobar, was living in a house in Colombia, in Medellin, which is the place where Pablo Escobar eventually set his empire up. And he had this bizarre episode that he describes that I still struggle to even believe today. So he started seeing ghosts walking into the wall of this house at a particular point of the house. Mm-hmm. And so eventually he just realized there was something odd about this bit of the house. So he started doing some measurements and realized there was a void space in that area of the house that was unexplained. There was no room behind there, but there was some space behind it. So he smashed down the wall with a sledgehammer and he found one of Pablo Escobar's hideouts, because Escobar had hideouts all across Medellin to avoid the authorities. And inside the hideout found a box containing millions of dollars of drug money that Pablo had stashed there, which obviously sounds like the kind of fancy dream you have where you discover your long-lost relatives' millions in the loft. But the problem for Nicholas Escobar was by the time he got to the money, of course it had sat there for decades, it was pretty much dust. In fact, as he was handling it, it fell to dust in his hands. And so as an analogy for, why you launder money, it was just perfect. I mean, it illustrates why Pablo laundered money because, he had to wash all this money he was making from cocaine. But it also illustrates how you should then go about it. If your drug money is in cash, A, it's vulnerable, somebody else might steal it. B, it's suspicious, the police might arrest you for it. But even if you can hang on to it through all of that, eventually it's just going to crumble to dust. You have to spend it on something, A, to enjoy it, but B, so that it's an asset that keeps building money for you. Good money laundering is basically long-term financial planning. And
investments.
The Escobar story just told it, yeah.
For sure. I mean, look, what other options had he? Bury it in the ground? It would have got destroyed by damp as well. And I mean, when I was reading that story about it, I always remember stories about Pablo Escobar, the rats eating the money he had stored in warehousing and blah, blah, blah. But like, I always thought if you kept money in a house, in the olden days, the way people used to keep it under the mattress or in the attic, like if the house went on fire, that's it, gone. Like,
even if you put it in a fireproof, waterproof, but if you protect the money as much as you can, the other problem you've got is inflation. Because of course, a banknote, as well, we know in the UK at the moment, a banknote today ain't worth as much tomorrow.
That's it, exactly, yeah. So, okay, things have changed dramatically since then. I suppose the mechanisms of crime and the criminal underworld and drug trafficking haven't, but the way that they launder money and they hide their money and they, wash it clean so as they can use it in the legitimate economy without fear of arrest has changed dramatically over that time.
It has, yeah. I mean, as I say, starting with the Pablo Escobar story and the drug cash was a convenient place to start because it gets over to people the issues around money laundering. Of course, in the book, we rapidly fast forward to the present day, and 2 things have happened, really. Number one, the whole financial system has digitized. I can't frankly remember the last time I used cash.
Yeah.
Increasingly, we talk about virtual currencies like Bitcoin. Increasingly, all currencies are virtual. Money moves sort of as ones and zeros on a screen. So as money launderers, you look at that and you think, well, that's great. I no longer have to, stash a box of cash in a loft. It's digitized. If there's some way I can use that digitized nature of money to move money around, great. The problem with that, of course, is it's still banks and finance companies, traditional finance companies, who control all of that. So the other thing that's emerged that's been a huge benefit is cryptocurrency, which obviously sits outside the traditional finance system. It's not run by a bank or a government. There's far less oversight, far less regulation of it, and it can move seamlessly, internationally, instantly. And that's of real use for money launderers. So those two things coming together have created a whole new field of money laundering. It's technologically savvy, technologically enabled. The people who really get all of this, high-tech finance stuff and can make it work for money laundering. They're in demand, those people at the moment.
And for sure. And also, isn't it the safer area of organised crime to work in? You don't really tend to hear of those people getting bullets in the head in the same way you do of those who are sort of more working on the ground on the front lines. That cryptocurrency and all the rest of that has been washing around for well over a decade, probably two, is it? How, at what point did that become a trustworthy thing for those who are investing their money? Because it feels, well, certainly I don't have any cryptocurrency or anything like it, so it still feels a little bit to me like I'd be just like keeping my photographs in the cloud. It took me a while to do that as well, so I'm not very modern with it. But, at what point did that start becoming really, really important to this organised crime world?
Well, it's interesting, yeah. I mean, when I first covered Bitcoin, I think it was in 2009, perhaps. At which point, one Bitcoin I think was worth about $6. It's now worth over 60,000. So no, like you, Nicola, I did not invest. Possibly a big regret. I don't know.
Absolutely.
But look, as a journalist, I want to keep clean hands. If I'd have invested, then when I covered crypto, people could accuse me of trying to, cover it in a particular way to increase my own investment. So you have to be a bit careful as a journalist, what you sort of get into.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, look, the reason I didn't invest was partly that, but partly also because I just thought it was mad. It just didn't make any sense whatsoever. And yet, this thing that's been around for, I think it's 16 years or so now, Bitcoin, has proved remarkably resilient. And the thing that behind it that tracks all those transactions of Bitcoin and that gives faith in this system is the blockchain, a publicly available ledger of who's transferred what money to who, or at least what Bitcoin wallet has transferred what money to what Bitcoin wallet. Technically, it's anonymous if you use it correctly. Now, that has hugely important ramifications. If you can track money and if you can make the blockchain work, that's of interest to financial institutions. It's of interest to governments because you can store voting records. There's lots of stuff you can do with this sort of blockchain type technology. But of course, one of the things about it is the anonymity, and the anonymity has been a massive boom, it has to be said, to organized crime and to online crime. One of the first big uses of cryptocurrency in the online crime space was, of course, Silk Road, the famous dark website where drugs and other things were traded, and it was all funded, as far as I could work out anyway, by Bitcoin. So what we've got is this very peculiar twin track thing with cryptocurrency, where on the one hand, increasingly authorities and governments and financial institutions and wise, clever, legal, legitimate people see this thing and think, yeah, we're going to hop on board with this. There's a recent announcement in the US of what's called an exchange traded fund, which I won't go into the minutiae of it, but basically it's something that proper legitimate, financy people like. There is now a Bitcoin version of that. So you can invest as a pensioner retired in the US, you can invest in Bitcoin alongside shares in, Sony or Walt Disney or whatever you want to invest in. So there's all that legitimate side, but at the same time, we've seen a growth in the illegitimate side, the money laundering side. Despite the best efforts of crypto tracing firms who track this stuff down, of anti-money laundering authorities who try and crack down on it, it is still a massive boon for money launderers because it moves internationally, it moves seamlessly and instantly, and it sits outside a lot of the regulation. It's a good way, if you can make it work, to move money as a launderer.
And why does it continue to sit outside the regulations if it's becoming something that, governments and more legitimate authorities are looking at as well and using?
That's a really good question. Regulators are trying to catch up with it. We've got multiple bits of regulation around the world at the moment that are trying to police cryptocurrency, police the marketplaces and the exchanges where you can buy and sell crypto and Bitcoin for pounds and dollars and so on. And that is happening. And has to be said, there's a bunch of the crypto community who want that to happen. They say, yes, we want to be legit. We want to be regulated. We want to be seen as like a bank or like a building society. Sign me up. However, there's another side that doesn't want to do that. Part of that's crime. There's exchanges and individuals who do not want to be regulated because they just don't want anyone to know what they're doing because it's criminal. There's also, though, a streak of people in this industry, the crypto industry, for whom privacy is really, really important and anonymity is really important as a sort of foundational mindset.
Mm-hmm.
The whole point for them of creating things like crypto was to take back control of money and to be able to control it and make it anonymous. And what those people in the crypto community say is, you don't regulate us like banks. Banks are the old institution. It's the old world. And let's face it, thanks to 2008 and the financial crash, they didn't do a particularly good job of that. We've created this new money, us techies. We control it. We built it. We've made it resilient. You don't come in here and tell us how to run it, mate. You can jog on. We regulate this ourselves. So that's why these regulations sometimes struggle, is because there are people in the crypto and tech community who just see it as an invasion of their space. It's like the old world. It's like your gran coming and telling you how to do things. It's like, no, I've got my own thing now and I run it. You can police the old world. This is our new world and we control it. There's a philosophical, like DNA-based objection to some of this regulation.
And you could see some of that same thought process in the kind of early days of the internet. There was these sort of, I suppose, outliers who were slight anarchists or whatever, and they believed that this had to be a non-policeable place, which many will argue it is. But yeah, there was that kind of political attitude in those early days of it, and maybe it remains, I suppose, obviously in the darknet area. But
yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I think it's a very good point. One of the early sort of internet pioneers was a guy called John Perry Barlow, who, if anybody's listened to the Grateful Dead and is a fan of that I suppose you'd call them a folk band in the US, the classic US hippie movement folk band. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. John Perry Barlow is one of their musicians. Now, he got early into the internet space, and he was a libertarian, and he saw this as being a new world, a world where governments didn't control things, a world where, the old laws didn't apply. It was a sort of frontiersman, Wild West kind of approach. And that was very much what he found appealing about it. And he wrote this classic thing called the Declaration of Cyberspace, which was a sort of a two fingers up basically to the forces of government, the fusty forces of old world, to say hands off. And you're exactly right. I think the strain of people in crypto that I'm talking about, and it's not everybody in crypto, the strain of people have that same thing of, this is our Wild West, this is our world. You don't get to come in here and be sheriff. We decide that, not you.
Exactly. So talking about the kind of people that are washing their money, and I was only having a conversation before I come in here about this. Obviously, those at the very high end of organised crime, at the top of their game, have loads of money because, they're the ones who are bringing it all in. But it seems to me like there's an awful lot of people in the middle, and particularly in drug dealing I'm talking about, that it all operates on tick, and there's constantly debts owed and to be paid, and the money slushes around. And certainly a lot of them that I would know or have come across, they just never actually seem to physically have the money they're owed it. And a bit like, I suppose, the builders, there's always loans and there's always money due and there's always people coming in looking to get paid and subcontractors and all this sort of stuff seems to happen. So is it everybody at every stage on that ladder that is needing to wash some money, or is it mainly the big boys?
It's a really good question, that actually. And it comes down to what you're trying to do with the money, at which level you're at. If you're, frankly, a street dealer dealing drugs, you would, as a mate of mine once did, you buy your eighth of your ounce of marijuana, you sell 7/8 of it, and you sell that for profit, and it buys your eighth, so you get to smoke for free. That's how that works at a very low level. Of course, the person he bought it from, the person they bought it from, as you go up the levels, the money increases and so on. So once you get to a certain level, as you say, you've got to move money around to pay off your debts for these larger sort of deals. Now, what's interesting is, you talked about things being done on tick, which isn't a phrase I'd come across, but I love it. Cryptocurrency and those kind of things can be used in that way, because you can say to somebody, okay, if I want to pay you a certain amount of money, here is my USB stick, for example, that's got my crypto wallet on it. Or here is the password for my crypto wallet on a piece of paper. I haven't given you money, but I've just given you access to the amount of money that I owe you. So it can be used, crypto, as a sort of token almost to exchange. In the same way that, from what I've heard, valuable artworks are passed around between criminals, not because they can buy them and sell them, but just because they're a token of, this artwork's worth £1 million. I owe you £1 million. Here's the artwork. Or here's the key for the locker where the artwork is stored. So you can move money around without in moving the money, if you like. You move the token of the money around. But at a certain point, everybody, if they want to really enjoy the money, has to cash out, And the wise way of cashing out is to invest your money in things like property, in things like artworks, restaurants, and so on. So at a certain level, there has to be somebody who helps you take these tokens and actually monetize them. So as a criminal, you get to enjoy them for a start, and you hang out in your apartment. But also, as well, you'll know, it's a sort of occupational hazard for criminals. They get arrested and do some time. When you come out of prison, you don't want to have to start again getting your money back together. You want to come out of prison, move back into your old apartment that the police couldn't seize because it's, bought with clean money, so you can get back on your feet and start again. So good laundering eventually pulls the money out and invests it into an asset that you can enjoy in the future.
Yes, or else the property crashes the price of it. And sure, look, they're living in the same world as we all are once they're in the legitimate economy, aren't they? So crypto seems to be very much where it's all going. I want to talk to you about just one area of the book, because there's loads of different chapters and each one of them is fascinating in itself. But this Black Axe gang, which are very prominent here in Ireland, and we'll come on to that, but they're started in Nigeria in the 1980s, and they feel like they were very ancient almost then with the rituals and all of that, but they have become a very sophisticated global sort of fraud grouping with cell structures in different countries. But I noticed from the book that you were saying that the axe was a symbol to break the chain of oppression, that it started in Benin, which is in Nigeria. And of course, that's a place where international traffickers will buy women into the sex industry. And they have certainly in the past had these markets where women from the countryside are brought and they'll buy them. And they're sold under this threat of voodoo. There's a lot of kind of ancient voodoo type beliefs in the area. And presumably the same thing happened within the college campuses there in the 1980s, that whole sort of fear and almost cult-like structure established.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so sort of late 70s, I think, is when Black Axe gets its start. And it starts out as a sort of a emancipation movement. As you said, the Black Axe was actually the axe that was going to break the sort of chains of colonial oppression. They were anti-apartheid. There was obviously race riots in the US. They were, supporting sort of black emancipation there. So it starts out as a very political sort of movement. It morphs the Black Axe into effectively a criminal enterprise for various reasons. And look, it's worth saying, it should make absolutely clear, the vast majority of people in Nigeria, and also Nigerians living outside Nigeria in places like Ireland, have nothing to do with any of this and have as dim a view as any of us of this kind of stuff. So
absolute, and hate the way the country has been painted as if it's, a sort of a fraud capital of the world. But really, the Black Axe have put them on the map in some ways.
And for me, I've looked at Black Axe in various different ways. Obviously, for me, cybercrime and financial crime is one of the Black Axe activities I'm most interested in. But as you say, within Nigeria, the offences attributed to the Black Axe are not white-collar offences. We're talking about people being beaten up, being killed. There are regular updates from Nigeria of what they call campus cult behaviour, including Black Axe. The people, for my money, that suffer the worst consequences of the hand of this are actually Nigerians living in Nigeria.
Right.
But what's interesting is the sort of scam behaviour that we talked about it seems to have started in the sort of 90s in Nigeria as the economy suffers and sort of morphs out from there. What's interesting is the scam behaviour. We're going back to the sort of classic Nigerian Prince email type stuff. Obviously, you're targeting victims in other countries around the world, richer countries, but higher income than a lot of people in Nigeria. Now, when they pay you the money, or when your victim pays you the money, telling them to send it to an account in Nigeria starts to look a bit sus. So sending it to an account locally, if you've got a victim in France, you try and get them to pay into an account in France. that's where money laundering comes in, because now you've got money that you've stolen from your fraud victim that's sitting in an account in France. Well, how do you get that account for a start? And then how do you move the money back to you if you're in Nigeria, for example? So the sort of money laundering side of that starts to take off. And so that's how Black Axe ends up really in money laundering, is as the crimes become more internationalized and bigger, the money laundering networks that Black Axe set up becomes even more important. And you now have this sort of global, it's almost, I think I described it in the book as like the interfloor of money laundering,
The Black Axe, in other words, started as a sort of political movement almost. Yeah. And then they turned into an organised crime group. Due to the economy in Nigeria, they had to look outward for those scams. As they became more sophisticated, they then had to look at sort of almost a cell-like structure in every country they were targeting. Is that my understanding of it?
Precisely so, yeah. My understanding as well from researchers who looked into Black Axe is that there were these cells, what are called zones around the world, and you'll have a zone head who sort of runs the organization. I have to say, it's interesting talking to researchers from outside Nigeria and researchers inside Nigeria, and also people, frankly, who've been in the Black Axe, one of whom I interviewed for the book. Definitely the Black Axe is involved in criminal activity around the world. There's no doubt about that. However, for some Nigerians, both in Nigeria and outside Nigeria, their exposure to the Black Axe is almost as a sort of it's a helpful organization for expatriates or for people trying to get places. I hesitate to draw the analogy, a little bit like something like the Rotary Club. It's a useful networking thing. Powerful, helpful, rich people are there. They can help you get a job. So, it depends which sort of bit of the prism you're looking through, that there is definitely the crime aspect. But for some people, their interactions with Black Axe guys are just of benefit for them to get a job. And they never actually come across the sort of criminal side. There's other people who, have Black Axe contacts and are asked, well, can we use your bank account, or can you do this thing for us, or can you get involved in this shady activity? So it's interesting. It's a really, really mixed picture. And I was trying to be quite careful in the book about how I described it and reflect those different views, because there are different views. But look, for the victims of the Black Axe's crime, there's no hesitation. They are fraudsters and involved in some quite serious crime.
And they have become very sophisticated, because you refer to that Nigerian prince email, and so that's all the way back in the 90s now. And that, of course, was sort of, he was inheriting a load of money or something and couldn't, that was it, yeah? And then needed your bank account, or, you had to send some money and you were going to get millions or something like that.
Yeah. It's what's called an advance fee fraud. And it's very simple. It's basically like, I promise you a massive amount of money in the future if you give me a bit of money now.
Yes.
And of course, you give me a bit of money now and I steal it, and that's it. You never get.
And if 1 in 100 targeted gave the bit of money, it was worth it, okay?
Oh, yeah.
So that's a simple thing. But everybody kind of knows that story. And I suppose as the 90s wore on, those emails became part of dinner party conversation, and people
yes.
Totally understood, except maybe elderly relatives who still seem to kind of believe it. But what did they move on to then? Or was it always that sort of thing that helped them develop and become more sophisticated? As people got to know their scams, they had to create others, and
it evolved. And one of the sort of heartbreaking things is, as you say, it became a bit of a round dinner party table joke, the Nigerian prince email. And there were people who would, engage and play along and that kind of thing. The problem was, look, those scams did make money, and they sort of laid the seed capital, if you like, for a much bigger wave of scams to come in the future. And what changed is that rather than targeting individuals for a few $100s or a few £100, those same people developed into what are called next level cyber criminals. And by next level, it means they're targeting organizations for tens of thousands, then hundreds, and sometimes millions of pounds. So you can use the same tactics. You can use the sort of advanced free fraud tactics, but you can use the trickery tactics to con large organizations out of money. And it's effectively the same scam. You're impersonating somebody. Rather than a Nigerian prince, you might impersonate an accountant or a lawyer or solicitor or conveyancer or a bank even, and you're trying to trick your victim into transferring money to you. Many of your listeners on that will surely be aware of romance scams. It's the same sort of thing. You contact somebody on a dating site and you spin them a line and you tell them a sob story and you try and get money out of them. We're now entering a new era of crypto scams, it's the same thing. You contact somebody, you tell them they can make huge amounts of money out of crypto if only they give you a little bit of money to invest. It's all the same sort of fraud. It's tricking your victim into transferring funds. It's just the targets of this have got bigger and bigger, and we're now talking, we're talking in the billions in terms of the amount of money stolen from victims as part of this.
And I want to ask you about the over sort of umbrella organisation of it. But here in Ireland, of course, the Garda's National Economic and Crime Bureau have been very vocal about the Black Axe grouping. And they say that, one of the most powerful organised criminals in Ireland has amassed an absolute fortune without any involvement in the drug trade. They describe him as a West African man aged in his 50s who's the leader of the Black Axe gang here in Ireland, which is a criminal network with up to 70 members, and there have been a wider grouping of more than 350 identified. And there's regular stories in the media here about them. So this is obviously a sort of what I would call a cell structure. You were calling them a zone. So this is the Irish wing of it. So is it completely independent, the original Black Axe? Are they in touch with one another in different countries? Do they take and give? You know what I mean? Do they use some of the laundering facilities available within cell structures in other countries, or how do they operate?
Well, it's interesting. The zones are, from what I've heard about it, fairly autonomous. You'll have a zone head who sort of runs that area. You'll have a sort of chief accountant who's keeping money, control and an eye on the money that's sort of coming in and out. And below that is a sort of classic pyramid structure, right down to the bottom, where you get, ordinary individuals, particularly in Ireland, who get recruited in without really knowing the full scale of it, and then tricked into sort of using their bank account in return for a bit of a profit. However, there does seem to be coordination internationally, because the way it was described to me was that part of the reason Black Axe activity in Ireland has escalated is a few years ago there was a sense among sort of Black Axe head office, if you like, that Ireland wasn't quite pulling its weight and that more could be done there.
Right.
Partly in perpetrating the scams, but also in laundering the money. And so one of the reasons that Black Axe activities escalated is because there was this push to try and do that, to try and do more activity in Ireland. So clearly there's some kind of sort of international coordination going on there.
And like, if you were operating in Ireland, and you're obviously, a lot of this is done on computers, are you just targeting your home country, or can you also target into other zones?
It's interesting. So there's two separate things here. There's the targeting of the victim, and there's where the victim's money gets laundered. So in the book, I talk about a particular case of a chap called Junior Baboye, who's suspected as being part of this sort of West African nexus of cybercrime and laundering. Now, Baboye was a really fascinating character. He was a sort of middleman, if you like, a link man between the people doing the hacking and defrauding the victims and the network of launderers who would then take that money out and wash it. And so his career is sort of fascinating. You kind of see through him both sides of the operation. Some of the victims whose stolen money he was helping launder were in Ireland. A famous case of XL Plastics, which is a plastics company just outside of Dublin, taken for, I think, €90,000. But some of them were foreign companies. There was a company in Spain called Imprex, which was taken, I think, for €180,000. Now, that money, obviously, it's not an Irish victim, but the money ends up in Ireland and is laundered through there. So what you get is this sort of kind of web structure where victims can be all over the place, laundering networks are all over the place, but you need someone like Junior Baboye who can put the two together. And again, you can move money internationally. You can move from Spain to Germany, to Ireland, to the US. There's somebody somewhere coordinating. It'd be fascinating to speak to them, coordinating how to link up the different crimes with the different laundering networks. And that's frankly, it's the kind of exercise a financial institution like a bank would do of, where have we got capacity? Where can we move this money? Who's got bank accounts we can use? There's coordination at the heart of this. It puts the organised in organised crime, doesn't it? This?
Yeah, for sure. And I presume each, zone will have a different skill set, perhaps, that they concentrate on. And obviously those sort of skill sets can be used by a little bit like the coming together of crime families for one purpose, which might be to move drugs. And you might have some which will be logistic experts, some which will be laundering experts, some may control the ports, the same kind of thing. Presumably they're working independently, but sometimes they come together if it's a benefit of mutual benefit to the groupings in different countries.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's interesting looking at sort of black axe activity or black axe attributed activity around the world. In the US, for example, there seems to be this whole trade around using cars and luxury car sales to kind of wash money. So, rather than sending, criminal money back across to other people in Nigeria, for example, you'd spend the money on a car and then you ship the car to the person who needs to get paid. So it sort of manifests itself differently. And as I say, there's somebody sort of, at least in an ad hoc way, keeping an eye on where the capacity is in laundering, where the crimes are being committed, where the laundering channels are, and pairing the one up with the other.
Let's talk a little bit about the North Koreans. The last time we spoke on this podcast, and we're going to actually repost this one, it was about your series, The Lazarus Heist, which was an extraordinary story about a group of hackers from North Korea who had stolen a huge amount of money from a Bangladeshi bank. And it really kind of brought you to this new book, Rinse, didn't it? Because you wondered after it, well, how did they launder the money? Because there's no point in stealing a load of money if you can't launder it. So in Rinse, there is a focus put on an individual called Hush Puppy and Big Boss. And they are, certainly Hush Puppy was at least an Instagram sensation who was living in Dubai, living the high life, but at the same time running a money laundering service in clear sight and dealing with these North Korean hackers to launder some of that money.
Yeah, exactly. So, Big Boss turns out to be a chap called Caleb Alamari, who's a Canadian citizen, and he gets involved with the North Koreans in laundering money that's been hacked from financial institutions. At a certain point, the North Koreans need to move the money through some bank accounts. So at that point, Big Boss, aka Caleb Alamari, gets in touch with his old mate called Hush Puppy, whose real name is Ramon Abbas. He's originally from Nigeria, ends up in Dubai. Now, as you say, Hush Puppy had something like 2.3 million Instagram followers, was an Instagram sensation. But there's always this thing with Instagram influencers of, well, where are you getting the money?
Yeah. Oh, I always think that with them.
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying all Instagram influencers are criminals, but certainly in Hush Puppy's case, he was funding a lot of that lifestyle by crime. But what's fascinating is, look, the two of them are absolutely fascinating. They could not be more chalk and cheese. They are the ultimate odd couple. And in the book, I've tried to really get that over, just how different these two people were. Caleb was born in Canada and lived literally in a mansion in Canada, like an 8-bedroom mansion. There's a private gate out the back to the local park. That's how rich this guy was. And also Caleb, Big Boss, there's nothing, I've got one photograph of him. I've got 0 on this guy.
Right.
Hush Puppy could not be more different. He's brought up in poverty in Nigeria, and then he creates this huge persona. I mean, there are thousands of photographs of Hush Puppy and videos as to all this material. And I think the idea that Hush Puppy, I say real name Ramon Abbas, I think the idea that he had was that if you can create a big enough profile, you're just too big to fail. You can pay enough people off, you can get away with it, and you'll have money to bribe people, but also the idea that you're committing crime, you can actually just grift through that and glide through that. And by the time people find out, it'll be too late. You'll be too big to kind of take down. And certainly, I think he almost certainly felt a certain amount of protection in Dubai. I think he felt that Dubai was a safe territory to live in. That
sounds like the story of the Emperor's New Clothes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
He's sitting on one of the pictures I saw of him. He's sitting on a private jet. He's practically lighting his cigar with a roll of dollar notes. Yep. So his idea was you'd do this in plain sight, and obviously he was at the same time advertising his services. How did these guys get going? Like, when do you first say, "Sorry, I'm a money launderer"?
Abbas, from what we know, was part of what we've talked about, the sort of black axe fraud Nigerian community. Again, worth stressing, tiny minority, but Abbas, who became Hush Puppy, was part of that scene, that fraud scene, back in the 90s in Nigeria. He obviously took it much further. His scams and his frauds became bigger and bigger, and he was making more and more money. And at that point, you come to people's attention. Big Boss in Canada, again, starts out doing kind of low-level credit card fraud. He's got a string of minor offences, and then he discovers the dark web. And that's it. He suddenly starts offering card cloning services, credit card fraud, money laundering services. Now, how Hush Puppy and Big Boss get together and know each other is still a bit murky. Big Boss ends up living in a place called Mississauga, which is on the outskirts of Toronto in Canada, which weirdly, Mississauga is like a sleepy little place in Canada. And actually it turned out to be a money laundering capital. Like big money launderers for the Black Axe were living there. Big Boss was also living there. So we think that he found out by the West Africans in this area of Canada, must have come across Hush Puppy through those channels. We think, I've been told, the North Koreans were flying into Dubai and were partying with Hush Puppy on boats, was how it was described to me. They were part of the sort of thriving scene of celebrities, in Dubai. So the North Koreans end up knowing Hush Puppy. Big Boss ends up knowing Hush Puppy. So when the North Koreans break in and want to launder the money, this triangle of people come together. The North Korean hackers, Big Boss, and Hush Puppy to try and launder the money. I have to say, the story of how they end up finding Big Boss and actually arresting him, even among what is already, as you can see, quite a jaw-dropping story, is absolutely breathtaking. And it's probably one of my favourite chapters of the book, of how the Secret Service get on the trail of Big Boss and eventually nick him. It's the classic thing where when they put out the press release, it sounds like it was quite easy. Oh, we found this guy and we arrested him. You talk to the investigators and it's a bobsleigh ride, a real chicane ride through craziness.
Can only imagine. Speaking about, I suppose, Hush Puppy and that open display of wealth and what he was doing, really, takes me to the Kinahans, and we can finish up on this. I'm not sure they have a place in the book, but they have a place in your ongoing investigations into money laundering and cryptocurrency, etc. But what always struck me was Johnny Morrissey, who's currently arrested in Spain, and he is been investigated for laundering a huge amount of maybe 280, 300 million euro worth of Kinahan drug money over an 18-month period, largely through a company called Nero Vodka, which was sanctioned by the US. And Johnny Morrissey was also named during the sanctions. But I do remember when that Nero Vodka launched down in Marbella, and it was during lockdown. So I was probably spending a lot of time looking at my computer, but they had a very sort of very extravagant launch party of the company. There was sort of Z-list celebrities are invited along to have their photographs taken. There was fire eaters. Johnny Morrissey, who I knew to be a major international criminal, was fronting it all up. There was no hiding, and Morrissey had also been fraternising with the Kinahans for a long time down there. It was very clear what was going on, and yet somehow they believed that this was the way to do this. Yeah. Is that a mindset that you've become untouchable, or does it work sometimes?
It's interesting. I think there's a number of factors with this. There's a psychological factor, which is, I think, from what I've seen of criminals, you don't become a criminal unless you like risk. If you don't like risk, don't become a crook. So already you've got a bunch of people for whom risk is a turn on. If they weren't running criminal enterprises, they'd probably be running, I don't know, hedge funds or investment firms or something. They just like risk. So that's for the first thing that, although I find it hard to understand, I think, that makes a bit of sense about it. Second thing is, if you're doing criminal activity, and again, the stuff you've covered around the Kinahans, the great book you wrote and the articles you've done point to this, where you've got to have some way of getting your criminal money cleaned. You've got to have some legitimate industry somewhere, whether it's a restaurant or a nail bar or a vodka company or, a boxing promotion thing. If you can have something that helps you take the criminal money and you can put it into a traditional financial institution and claim it's the results of, your vodka sales or whatever, that's going to be helpful for you. And I think at the heart of this, there is this idea that if you get big enough and you make enough money and you make enough of an impact, you'll have powerful and influential people, possibly in the police, the judiciary, the government, who will not necessarily derail a prosecution into you, but delay it or tip you off. I think there's this idea that getting big and rich and powerful will have ancillary benefits. So I think between all of those different sort of explanations I've given there, that's how these people end up with these crazy things. But for journalists like ourselves, Nicola, it's a boon, frankly, to be able to put that in front of viewers and listeners and readers. And
absolutely, but that is
the story.
I mean, you've just described, I suppose, the mindset that they believe they become untouchable, which we use constantly, and it's usually used before there's a fall or everything swings. We're going to talk a little bit about maybe the Kinahans and cryptocurrency and whether they were laundering. I mean, no doubt any organisation as big as them are using every angle and new tool for laundering money because they've so much to bloody well wash clean.
Yeah, absolutely. I looked into this a bit for the book, but didn't end up including it. Partly because journalists like yourself have done a fantastic job of covering it. But yeah, accusations around people connected with the Kinahan cartel using cryptocurrency, which surprised me not a bit. Also, the Dubai connection, much as Dubai, are trying to clean up and talking about cleaning up and so on. Dubai and cryptocurrency, that did not surprise me a bit. And look, it's a classic logistical exercise, money laundering. The drugs are not in Dubai. The drugs are being made and shipped somewhere else. So you have to move the money to where the supply is, and that requires a path for the money. Crypto is amazing. You can, for that purpose, it's amazing. You can literally wire instantly, $1 million worth of crypto to somebody simply by texting them the password to the crypto wallet, and it's done. The money is there and accessible to them. So to be able to move your money liquidly around the world to where you need it, to jurisdictions you need it in, makes perfect sense.
It's the easiest way, obviously.
Yeah, it is the easiest way until, as I say, you need to get that crypto to pay for something, at which point you need the vodka company, or you need the bank account, or you need the broker. That's where the money launderers come back in.
I think the Kinahan organisation became and are so big that there's suspicions that they were able to afford to set up their own encrypted phone network. They didn't need to buy into the kind of the regular EncroChat ones. And possibly they were able to set up their own chain, as you call it, blockchain, and their own sort of currency even. Certainly there is some suspicions that they were looking into it if it wasn't something they had done. That comes on foot of 15 years ago. They were looking at buying their own container ships to move drugs across the globe. They were always ambitious. So absolutely nothing, I think, could surprise us with them. And I think that story is still unfolding. And, in a few years' time, maybe we'll be sitting talking about something that will be even more jaw-dropping than anything we've talked about before.
I'm sure so, hopefully, yes. Well, I'd say hopefully for us as journalists, for society and the victims, that's obviously not a hope that we have.
It's Jeff White, and the new book is called Rinsed. It's out in the middle of June, and it can be pre-purchased, I presume, on Amazon?
It can, and bookshop.org. Bookshop.org, do it via your local bookstore. So if you want to support your local bookstore, bookshop.org you could do, or Amazon's fine.
Yeah, it's a good way of doing it. So it's one for the sunbeds, obviously. You've perfect timing. Okay, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on.
Great to speak to you. Thank you for having me.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.